Welcome back to Hello Mizoram. This is part 2 of our series on looking at the concept of death in early Mizo society. In our last video, we looked at the 9 different types of deaths that were categorized by our early Mizo ancestors. And in this video, we're going to be looking at the different types of burials that they had and what early pre-Christian Mizo society believed happened to the soul or spirit of the person once they died. In 2013, Mizo academic Lalthangliana conducted a study on the traditional burial system of the Mizo people. Now, there were different types of burials depending on the class or societal position of the person who had died. Number 1, Dian. Now, this was the type of grave that was only reserved for a young person who had died in the prime of their life, or a Kawtchhuah, which meant one of the warrior hunters who were so revered in the community. This type of grave would be dug very deep and at a slight angle so as to give the appearance that the body was almost standing up, not quite fully lying down. This grave would be quite unique in the sense that all the walls within would have been lined with stone slabs and then covered on top with another large stone slab. This type of grave was especially common among the Boi or Lai tribe. Number 2, Curlan. This was the average grave structure for the common person. The body would be wrapped up in a bamboo matting and lowered into the earth horizontally at about 5 foot deep into the ground. The corpse would then be moved sideways into the hole head first, and this compartment would be closed with a bamboo mat, and then finally the grave itself would be enclosed with either earth, bamboo, wood, or stones. Here is footage from 2020 when an actual Kawtchhuah grave was unearthed in the Bagdong area in Mizoram.
Chatak mai Kawtchhuah oma achunga hian luru le Mapuia ru ni om takte oma engtik lai phum nge niang pi po hriat thein ni to lowa hi holai tak mai oma ni mak hle maya uluk taka than hi chin ania lungte po ti hian ala kan puang hian thatak main Kawtchhuah ania a chung zong hian kher tha kania chu lungin asir ton tona hian abang siam ania a chunga lungin chin le vek ania le chen hi bak tong khuwa kumza somhi chuang kumsa somni do na lo ni to a emi chung hian heng lai than muala man kan upa te hian an shelowa engti khun lai a om nge niang ti chu rin thu bo soi ngai na a om lo ani tu te nge niang eng rual nge ti po ke niang dong chon kan hre thiam lowa than hui alo oma uluk takasiam ani a Kawtchhuah ani.
Number 3, Lungguang. This literally translates to grave made of stones and was only reserved for village chiefs or other prominent people in the community. The entrance to the grave would be dug at about 4 to 5 feet deep, and then a compartment would be dug out on one side of the cavity into which the body would be placed. All the walls and floor would be lined up with flat stones. Because this was such a time-consuming and laborious process, it indicated the magnitude of the loss of the person that had died. Number 4, Kuang Ur. At some point in early Mizo society, the Mizo people did not traditionally bury the rich and influential members of their community, especially the chief. Instead, they had a very unique tradition called Kuang Ur. Instead of burying the body, they would use a kuang or a wooden coffin to fumigate the body. The body was sealed in a wooden coffin with a bamboo pipe inserted into the deceased person's stomach and leading out from a hole at the bottom of the coffin and into a pit in the ground below. We're here at the Mizoram State Museum, and here we have a replica of the wooden coffin that would have been used to fumigate the chief of the village in Old Mizo society. So as you can see, the wooden trunk would have been carved out hollow inside, big enough to fit the person. They would have also crafted a small hole on the bottom of the coffin so that underneath there would have been a large fire that would have been kept going for 1 to 3 months, depending on the source. That fire was meant to fumigate or smoke out the flesh of the dead person inside. After a sufficient amount of time had passed, usually the son-in-law of the family would open up the top of the coffin to just see how the process was going along and see if it was progressing well. Now, after the 3 months had passed, usually by this time, all of the flesh would have fallen off of the person and it would have been drained out with all the fluids through the hole underneath. According to Mizo historian Remkunga, the young men of the village would have continuously collected firewood during the day to keep the fire going underneath the coffin at all times throughout the 3-month period. Usually, the job of collecting firewood was only left to the younger boys, but because of the stature of the chief, the young men would collect firewood as a gesture of reverence for the chief and a last act of service to him. Finally, the relatives would collect the skull and usually the larger bones of the remains, and they would put them for safekeeping in a very special basket. The smaller bones, however, they would usually put in small jars and bury them. Our Mizo ancestors believed that when their loved ones died, their spirit stayed on among them for a while. During this period, families would offer cooked food and rice beer to the departed souls, placing them on a shelf near the storage area. This belief that the departed would partake of the food offered by the living became the origin story of an annual festival called Mim Kut. While some tribes celebrated it in December or January, most Mizo clans celebrated it in the month of August or September, when the monsoon season meant there would be a rich supply of fresh crops, particularly melons and cucumbers, which they could share with the spirits of the dead. The living would sing songs with other family members who had gathered together, and these were often songs lamenting the loss of their loved ones. Traditionally, it was also during this festival when the bones of their loved ones that were kept in jars or in closed baskets would be taken out, cleaned, and paid homage to for the duration of the celebration. On the 3rd day of the festival, the vegetables that had been offered to the spirits of the dead were now collected, cooked, and eaten by the living, because by now, the Mizo people believed, the spirits of their loved ones had once again returned to the land of the dead. To understand why early Mizo society believed food was such an important aspect of the afterlife, let's take a quick look at a famous Mizo story about a woman named Tlingi and her husband named Ngama. Tlingi and Ngama loved each other deeply, but because of objections to their being wed, their relationship endured many challenges. Tlingi fell ill and eventually died. Ngama, her husband, would tend to her grave and plant zamzo flowers on top of it. When the flowers started disappearing, he discovered that the spirit of his wife was sending weasel-like animals to pick the flowers he had been planting and bring them to her in the land of the dead. He followed the animals back to Mitikwa, the land of the dead, where he was reunited with Tlingi, but soon realized there were differences too great to overcome, while she was a spirit and he remained mortal. agreeing to reunite when Ngama joined her in the land of the dead as a spirit himself. Ngama returned to the land of the living, where he would plant vegetables and fruits for Tlingi, who had grown frail from hunger in the land of the dead. This is why early Mizo people would ceremonially offer food and other crops to their deceased relatives. Ngama eventually became resolute to be reunited with Tlingi and ended his life. When he was finally reunited with his wife in the land of the dead, he was delighted to see she had been receiving the crops he'd left her all along while he was alive, and now she had become plump and healthy again. As we mentioned earlier, the Mizo people believed that once a person had died, their spirit actually hung around for a little while until they actually set off into the afterlife. Now, this journey could only take place once the spirit had cut off all earthly connections. According to some scholars, our Mizo ancestors believed that when a person died, their spirit left the body from the top of their head. After this, it would pass by the various most familiar areas within their home before eventually exiting the house. At this point, it was believed that the soul would wander around the village for up to 3 months. During this 3-month period in limbo, where the soul appeared to be hovering between the physical and spiritual worlds, the family would continue to take their needs into account and continue to place food at the table for them should they need to sustain themselves. For early Mizo society, the ultimate end goal was to get into one of 2 eternal abodes, either Mitikwa, which was the land of the dead, or Bialral, which was a kind of paradise. But that was only the beginning. There was still a long and arduous roadmap that the soul had to go on in order to get to either of these 2 places. In the next video, we're going to look at exactly what that epic journey looked like. See you next time on Hello Mizoram.